I can't believe I'm saying this, but I am completely disappointed in Alex O'Connor. If you don't know who he is a famous atheist skeptic, over 1 million subscribers on YouTube, just passed, I want to say a couple months ago, made a reaction video to Wes Huff, Canadian apologist who went on Joe Rogan's podcast trying to cut away from what Wes Huff had claimed in that podcast. Now, I am someone that loves Alex O'Connor. I think he does a phenomenal job at representing the Christian perspective when debating other atheists and skeptics, agnostics. I cannot stress this enough how disappointed I am in this last video he put out trying to discredit what Wes Huff was saying during the podcast. We're going to be addressing some of those misconceptions and correcting what Alex O'Connor got wrong regarding his perspective of what Wes Huff did. Let's go ahead and check out this video.
Rising star Wes Huff was just on Joe Rogan to talk about the Bible, and so, of course, I had to make a response. We begin with a claim about the book of Isaiah. For a long time, our earliest copy of the book of Isaiah dated to the Middle Ages, so it was difficult to know if it had been accurately preserved or changed over the thousands of years since it was written. But then we discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls, a set of ancient manuscripts found in Qumran dating to around 2,000 years ago. And amazingly, within them, we found a complete copy of the book of Isaiah, 1,000 years older than the oldest one that we had until then. Take a listen.
So when you say the book of Isaiah is intact, how similar is it to the book of Isaiah that's in the Bible?
So that one is fascinating. So this isn't true for all of the Dead Sea Scrolls, but when we discovered the Great Isaiah Scroll, previous to that, the earliest copy of Isaiah that we had was in the Masoretic text, which is in the Middle Ages.
Whoa.
Yeah, so it was literally 1,000 years. We literally pushed back our understanding of Isaiah 1,000 years. And the thing that really shocked scholars, like I said, this isn't true for all the Dead Sea Scrolls, but one of the things that shocked them about Isaiah was that it was word for word identical to the Masoretic text.
Word for word.
Word for word.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow, that would be amazing if it were true.
Real quick, before Alex starts to dump on Wes Huff for his statement that basically the oldest scroll of Isaiah we had was around the Middle Ages. And so when we got the Dead Sea Scrolls, you're pushing back 1,000 years of history regarding an Old Testament manuscript of the book of Isaiah. And Wes Huff makes a claim that it was virtually word for word the exact same. In that same sentence, you'll notice Wes Huff has no problem saying that the other manuscripts weren't the same. So, and if you notice, what he had just said a second ago was that it's not the same for all of them. But for Isaiah, it is the same. Now let's listen to Alex's pushback here.
In fact, the Dead Sea version of the Isaiah scroll is not quite identical to the Masoretic text, that is, the one that we know from the Bible. Can you guess how many textual variants there are between the two? Take a guess. 1 that Wes forgot about? 10? 100? Try more than 2,600. Yeah. Now, most of these variants are...
Yeah. So if you know nothing about the Bible and you hear this from Alex O'Connor, you're thinking, wow, 2,600 variants of the book of Isaiah. So not only is Wes Huff wrong in misrepresenting the truth, he's vehemently wrong. I mean, I cannot believe Wes Huff would make such a crazy claim. He is a PhD scholar when it comes to or he's on his way to a PhD when it comes to manuscripts. So what is Wes Huff talking about? He's talking about the multiple scrolls of Isaiah that we have. And so, yes, there might not be one specific Isaiah scroll that has word for word exactly what he's talking about, but all of the manuscript evidence points to a word for word accuracy. And the 2,600 discrepancies that he's talking about, most of the time it has to do with spelling. It doesn't have to do with the actual content of the book of Isaiah. It's a spelling issue or apostrophes being added or punctuations, I should say. So Alex is going to try and dump on Wes Huff for saying this and makes this crazy claim about 2,600 variants. But the issue is you're not actually losing content with that, and you're also not taking into account the multiple manuscripts of Isaiah that we had gotten from the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Oh, there are differences in spelling, for example, but some of them are more significant. For instance, in Isaiah chapter 2, the end of verse 9 and all of verse 10 are simply missing from the Dead Sea version. They're just not there, which tells us that...
And that's a blatant lie. They're not missing from the Dead Sea. Maybe one specific manuscript, but there are multiple manuscripts of the book of Isaiah. And so here Alex is discrediting Wes Huff when he's making a even more damaging claim.
They were a later addition. Here are some words from the Digital Dead Sea Scrolls project by the Israel Museum, which houses the Isaiah Scroll. The text of the Great Isaiah Scroll generally confirms the Masoretic or traditional version codified in medieval codices, all 66 chapters of the Hebrew version in the same conventional order. At the same time, however, the 2,000-year-old scroll contains alternative spellings, scribal errors, corrections, and most fundamentally, many variant readings. Strictly speaking, the number of textual variants is well over 2,600, ranging from a single letter, sometimes one or more words, to complete variant verse or verses.
And what's interesting about this comment that Alex brings up is if you actually continue reading here, it literally references, for example, underneath the bolded here, for example, the second half of verse 1 and verse 9 and all of verse 10 in the present Masoretic version of chapter 2 are absent from the Great Isaiah Scroll in Israel's museum. And then it continues on. The same verses, however, have been included in other versions of the book Isaiah in the scrolls found near the Dead Sea. So that he uses an article to prove his point, and in the next paragraph, it actually discredits his point because it's proving that, hey, they actually are showing up. The next section that Alex O'Connor decides to talk about is the divinity of Jesus. Now, if you've watched Alex's content enough, you know he mentions this all the time. He has this view of Jesus. He basically claims that it's only the Gospel of John that really has any claims regarding the divinity of Jesus. Therefore, Jesus' divinity is more of a later addition to the person of Jesus because Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the synoptic Gospels, aren't really communicating that Jesus is God in any which way or so. And so he tries to discredit Wes Huff's claim here to Joe Rogan that Jesus claimed to be God. Let's continue to watch.
Well over 2,600. Again, many of these variants are
Word for word.
which is simply not true. Okay, moving on to the New Testament.
Was it the book of Isaiah?
Yeah.
That the same book is exactly the same as, like, that's a miracle.
Yeah.
That's pretty fucking crazy.
Yeah, that's crazy.
If you just imagine the sheer number of illiterate
forget the
people,
language.
the sheer number of days that have to go by where people are telling the story exactly the same, and that it's entrusted in the hands of these very few people that are so dedicated to it that they get the exact words right 1,000 years later, pretty bananas.
Well, I mean, that is kind of the crazy thing about Christianity, where you have this Jewish itinerant guy who's walking around first century Roman-occupied Judea. He's making some pretty audacious claims to be God himself, and then he predicts his own death and resurrection. And then his disciples they think it's over. Like, they're like, he's dead, we're done.
Yeah.
And then they go from 11, scared men, because Judas commits suicide, scared men in an upper room, to completely overhauling the Roman world in only a couple hundred years because of this claim that they say they saw Jesus resurrected. Like, there's something different that goes on there, that they're like, this is a miracle, right? Dead people don't usually rise from the dead.
There was quite a lot there. First, Wes says that Jesus was audaciously going around claiming to be God himself. I don't think that's true. Nowhere in Mark, Matthew, or Luke does Jesus actually claim to be God in his own words. At best, it's...
Real quick, just to be clear, he's saying, I don't believe that to be true. The entirety of the early church believed it to be true. If you actually go back to early church councils, for example, go back to the Council of Nicaea, the main issue when it came to certain doctrines was Christological in nature. Let me break it down for you. The doctrines that were discussed in the early church councils were talking about the divinity and nature of Christ himself. Why? Because the early church really believed for him to be God. The apostles, the original disciples, really believed Jesus was God. And so even though Alex might believe, well, I don't really think that Jesus claimed to be God, everyone else but him in the first, second, third century, and until today, by the way, because if you're a true follower of Christ, Orthodox teaching is Jesus Christ was God in the flesh, Emmanuel, God with us. In the Word, in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God, yada, yada, yada. John 1:1, right? You know the passage. Like, since the first century, every person that was a follower of Jesus virtually unanimously agreed in the deity of Christ.
just in John's Gospel that divine claims begin to appear.
Here we go.
I and the Father are one.
The John
Whoever has
Gospel
seen me
thing.
has seen the Father. Before Abraham was, ego eimi. I actually still don't think even these count, and we'll explain why in another video, but let's just say that they do. Even if this was Jesus explicitly claiming to be God, don't you think it's a bit suspicious that these claims only show up in our latest Gospel? If Jesus was known to be walking around claiming explicitly to be God himself, did the other 3 Gospel authors just not think this was relevant? A minor, unimportant detail not worth including? Come on. Anyway, Wes also mentioned how it was...
Let's pause there for a second, because I'm going to completely discredit everything he just said. So he made the claim that the Synoptic Gospels don't talk about the divinity of Jesus, okay? Most scholars believe that the Gospel of Mark is the earliest gospel recorded. Most scholars also believe that Matthew and Luke, I should say, use the Gospel of Mark to give a foundation for the historical account of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. So if the Gospel of Mark is the earliest manuscript, the earliest gospel, I should say, what would Alex say if the Gospel of Mark actually shows that Jesus is God? Don't think I'm telling the truth? Let me show you real quick. This is Mark chapter 2. One of the first, or the second chapter in the Gospel of Mark, and we get the story of Jesus. When he entered Capernaum after some days, it was reported that he was at home. So many people gathered together. There was no more room, not even the doorway, and he was speaking the word to them. So this is a famous story of this paralytic being carried by 4 people, bringing him through the roof because it was so crowded, okay? And we get this story where Jesus tells the paralytic in verse 5, "Son, your sins are forgiven." And the scribes are sitting there questioning in their hearts, why does he speak like this? He's blaspheming. Who can forgive sins but God alone? So the Pharisees knew the claim of Jesus when he said, "I'm going to forgive sins," that claim can only be claimed by God himself, which is why the Pharisees the scribes accused him of blaspheming. What continues on? Verse 8. Right away, Jesus perceived in his spirit that they were thinking like this within themselves and said to them, "Why are you thinking these things in your hearts? Which is easier?" I love Jesus. Which is easier? To say to the paralytic, "Your sins are forgiven," or to say, "Get up, take up your mat, and walk"? But so that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. He told the paralytic, I tell you, get up, take your mat, and go home. I want you to see this here. When Jesus says, so that you may know the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins, what he is claiming there is to be God. Because in verse 7, it says he's blaspheming. Who can forgive sins but God alone? And Jesus is responding, so that you may know that I am God because I'm forgiving sins. So this completely dismantles Alex's argument that the deity of Christ is a later element, a later progression in the character of Jesus in terms of his divinity. It is early in the Gospel of Mark, and I'm disappointed that he keeps peddling this idea that Jesus was just a teacher and later in life they said he was God. Let's continue.
It was amazing that the early church grew from 11 scared disciples to overhauling the Roman world. On this, the sociologist Rodney Stark estimates that in its first 300 years, Christianity grew at a rate of 40% per decade, from a small group in the 1st century to 3 million in the 4th century. That sounds pretty impressive, until you learn that this is the same growth rate experienced by Mormonism since its foundation in the 19th century. So if the rate of Christianity's growth is good evidence of its truth, Mormonism just became a whole lot more plausible. By the way, we actually have 11 eyewitnesses to the Mormon golden plates, whose names and written testimonies we still have today. 3 of those witnesses say that they saw the angel Moroni give Joseph Smith the plates with their own eyes. And even when they fell out with Joseph Smith and left the church, they still continued to assert that they had witnessed these events.
Why do they? By the way, I don't want to go into Mormonism on his video, but the Mormon eyewitnesses had a positive motive for them to affirm that they had seen this supposed angel and miracle happen. And on top of that, when it comes to the witnesses of the supposed plates of Joseph Smith, no one else saw them except the 3 witnesses and Joseph Smith. The claim of Jesus in 1 Corinthians 15 is that Jesus appeared to, of course, the initial woman, then the 12, and then you have the other 500 witnesses of Jesus appearing. It's not some isolated incident. And then, of course, we get this famous story of Doubting Thomas where he actually feels Jesus to prove that Jesus physically rose from the dead. It wasn't just some mythical story. So let's not go into Mormonism, but, Alex is trying to grasp for straws here.
Have anything like this kind of extant
secular to even entertain the possibility that someone died and come back to life.
And I get that. But we've already talked about the fact that we don't think that the only thing that exists is matter and motion. We as in you and I, right? Like, we believe that there's something else going on in this world that's a little bit crazy.
There's something else.
And that to, I think, exclude that, I think excludes something that you're kind of putting blinders on. for. And you do have, I mean, you're right in terms of all of these ancient conventions and the ways that things were spread around. But the Gospels are written in the lifetime of the eyewitnesses. And they're written in this period of time where you have groups of individuals who could have fact-checked those things.
Okay, it gets a bit speculative here. Scholarly consensus is that the earliest gospel, Mark, was written around 70 AD. This is some 40 years after Jesus died, and likely after the death.
By the way, that's also a misrepresentation. It's not the scholarly consensus that the Gospel of Mark was written at 70 AD. Yes, some scholars do believe that the Gospel of Mark was written at 70 AD, but that's not the consensus of scholars. For example, this is a book called Rethinking the Dates of the New Testament by Jonathan Bernier. And there are about 4 different categories of authorship regarding, I shouldn't say of authorship, there are 4 categories of dates that scholars believe when the Gospel of Mark was written. The highest end is 80 AD 80. So 80. The middle of the pack by Harnack is between 65 and 73 AD. That's what probably Alex is referring to. But then there's the lower side of actually AD 45 by the scholar Robinson, and then Bernier actually believes between 42 and 45 AD. So to make the claim that the scholarly consensus is 70 AD in the Gospel of Mark, that's misrepresenting the facts
Of most of the eyewitnesses, given life expectancy in the ancient world. But even if it were written earlier, even if it were written by Mark himself, we're talking about the resurrection here. And notice that the earliest version of Mark's gospel does not contain any descriptions of post-resurrection appearances. It ends with the empty tomb and a disappeared Jesus and suggests that he will appear to people, but it doesn't record those appearances. So even if it's written by an eyewitness, it doesn't report anything about the resurrected Jesus. The most numerous and detailed...
The reason for that is because that wasn't the purpose of Mark's gospel. If you read the very first verse of the Gospel of Mark, it says this is the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Mark wasn't concerned with the extra stories about Jesus' post-resurrection appearance. He wasn't concerned with the Great Commission. He wasn't concerned with what the apostles' mission to go out and make disciples or declare that repentance for the forgiveness of the sins would be proclaimed throughout all the nations. He wasn't worried about being my witnesses through Jerusalem, Judea, and Samaria. He was concerned with the gospel of Jesus Christ, and that's why Mark wasn't focused on including those stories. Also, the longer ending of Mark, which most scholars believe isn't included in the earliest manuscripts, or isn't included in the earliest manuscripts of Mark, still believe that edition is still very, very early in church history. The YouTuber Mark Winger did a video on this where he talks about the longer ending of Mark. I encourage you to go watch that video.
Post-resurrection appearances of Jesus are in the 4th gospel, the Gospel of John. Scholarly consensus dates this to somewhere between 90 and 100 AD. Wes Huff suggests an earlier dating based on an ancient fragment of the Gospel of John called P52. Here's what he says.
So you were talking about what is our oldest manuscript evidence? So this guy is P52. John Ryland's 457. So that's a genuine Egyptian papyri that I made. I cut it out for you, and then I transcribed the text on that manuscript. So when we're talking about what is potentially our oldest evidence for the New Testament, this manuscript that most likely comes from Oxyrhynchus, Egypt, is the one that usually is universally accepted as our oldest one. And that contains John 18, where Jesus is on trial before Pilate. And yeah, so that's the one. It's in the John Rylands Library in Manchester, England. The reason I bring this up is because before this was discovered by C.H. Roberts in the 1940s, the convention was, because of a guy named C.H. Bauer, that the Gospel of John was 2nd century. C.H. Roberts is, literally going through these piles of manuscripts in these drawers that are being stashed away. And he finds this guy and he sees that it's written on both sides, which is almost exclusively a Christian convention. Because in the ancient world, they used scrolls. And the Christians, for reasons we're not entirely clear on, they start to make codices, books. And so they write on both sides. And so he says, okay, this is written on both sides. It's probably a Christian manuscript. So he sends it off to the leading paleographers, or guys who date manuscripts. And they all say, this is the beginning of the 2nd century. And so there's still debate about the dating of this, but the unanimous consensus is that it's comfortably 2nd century, potentially the beginning of the 2nd century, which means that this is found in Egypt. John is probably writing his gospel in Ephesus, so it has to be written by John, spread around, find its way to Egypt, be copied, and then end up in this manuscript, which means that at minimum, you've already pushed the Gospel of John back into the 1st century comfortably, and potentially even, most likely into the lifetime of the eyewitnesses of these events. And so all of the literature up until that point from the scholarly consensus about the dating of the Gospel of John gets totally rewritten.
Wow.
He correctly points out that there is dispute in the dating here. But notice that while Wes places P52 in the 2nd century,
it's comfortably 2nd century.
He pushes John's gospel itself at minimum and comfortably back into the 1st century.
Which means that at minimum, you've already pushed the Gospel of John back into the 1st century comfortably.
The all-new GoDaddy Arrow helps you get your business online in minutes with the power of AI. With the perfect...
Why? Well, because of the time it would take after John wrote the Gospel in Ephesus for it to travel to Egypt and be copied.
Written by John, spread around, find its way to Egypt, be copied, and then end up in this manuscript.
A few problems with this. First, Wes assumes that the 4th Gospel really was written by John the Apostle in Ephesus. This is, to say the least, heavily contested by New Testament scholars, but even so, Egypt just isn't all that far away from Ephesus, reachable in a few weeks for an ancient traveler, maybe a bit long.
I love how he literally shows a picture of a massive distance between the Middle East area and Egypt, and then he mentions about it taking a few weeks. That's not a short time of travel for an average person.
Originally, P52 was thought to date between 100 and 150 AD, split the difference at 125. Even if this early dating is correct, that still gives us 25 years for the Gospel to have travelled from Ephesus to Egypt and still have been written within the 2nd century. But of course, even this dating is disputed. In 2012, Professor of Early Christianity Brent Nongbury wrote a paper in the Harvard Theological Review dispelling this very use of P52 to date the Gospel of John, called The Use and Abuse of P52. Here's what he says. What I have done is to show that any serious consideration of the window of possible dates for P52 must include dates in the later 2nd and early 3rd centuries. Thus, P52 cannot be used as evidence to silence other debates about the existence or non-existence of the Gospel of John in the first half of the 2nd.
Listen what even the text that he's even reading. It's saying that it cannot be used to silence evidence regarding debates about the dating of the Gospel of John, but it doesn't mean it can't be used at all. Even at the end of his sentence here, it says it takes 2nd place to other forms of evidence. But 2nd place is still right behind 1st place. To say it's not the number one usage of evidence we should use, I agree with that. But 2nd place means it's a 2nd form of evidence that we should be referencing. And I could have a whole conversation about the dating of the Gospel of John. Bernier, the book that I just referenced, actually dates it between 80, 60, and 70. So there's some more food for thought. This video is very frustrating with Alex because he literally nitpicks at every single thing that Wes says and takes the most skeptical approach regarding the things that he is saying. And then even in his conversation says, well, let's just assume this is true. But what he's really saying is, I don't believe it to be true, but I'm just going to take it as a grain of salt so I can continue my argumentation, discrediting any aspects of validity regarding what Wes is saying. Now, let's go into this last section here. This video is a long video. I can't go through the whole thing, but Alex addresses the 1 Corinthians 15 passage, which is one of the earliest passages we have regarding the resurrection of Jesus appearing to the witnesses. And Alex makes this crazy claim about 1 Corinthians 15:6, and it gets completely dismantled. You're going to watch here in a second.
Dating squarely from the middle of the 1st century. And we think that he actually did write at least 7 of the letters, whomever. Okay, moving on. After mentioning the Gospels, Wes goes on to talk about Paul. Whenever the Gospels were written, and by whomever, we know that Paul is the earliest source of the New Testament, dating squarely from the middle of the 1st century. And we think that he actually did write at least 7 of the letters attributed to him. And so it's to him that we now turn.
How do you fact check someone coming back from the dead?
Well,
how many people saw his body, right?
Well, Paul says that 400 people saw him all at once.
400 people saw the crucifixion?
No, saw the resurrected Jesus. Yeah, 1 Corinthians
500.
15. Paul says that Jesus appeared to the disciples, and then
Which, by the way, is actually really frustrating. People are also nitpicking Wes Huff on this whole podcast. It was like 3 hours long. Like, how long have you sat for an interview being grilled on all issues of Christianity, going from textual criticism to theology to doctrine to practical ministry application? I mean, he was questioned on a broad spectrum of topics. And I actually watched another interview with Wes, and he said that 80% of the things that he prepared for weren't even talked about in this podcast. So give Wes some grace. My goodness.
To 400 people all at once.
Wes gets this slightly wrong, as Paul actually says that Jesus appeared to 500, not 400 people at one time. But this only makes it all the more amazing. 500 people witnessing the physically resurrected Jesus would be an amazing proof of his resurrection. Unfortunately, 1 Corinthians chapter 15 is the only mention we have of this event anywhere. It's not in the Gospels, nor in Acts, nor in any other historical source. So, what do we learn about this event from 1 Corinthians?
That's actually not true at all. So the whole passage of 1 Corinthians 15 talks about Jesus appearing before the 12. That's attested in every single gospel if you were to include the longer ending of Mark.
Nothing. Nothing at all. Paul does write that, quote, he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, but that's it. We're not told who these people are, or why they were gathered, or when this occurred, or how Paul learned about it, or how he knows the number of people involved. Paul himself wasn't there. Is this just something that he heard about? From whom? When? We're not told anything.
I want you to think about this, and this is why I'm so disappointed in this video of Alex. He does such a good job at representing the Christian position correctly. And in this video, he should change his name back to Cosmic Skeptic. He used to be called Cosmic Skeptic, and he took it out. I think it's in his YouTube tag now. Now he just goes by Alex O'Connor. But this is taking a hyper-skeptic approach to this passage. Would you ask those same questions to any historian that's reporting on certain events? Well, how'd you learn from it? And what about this? And what about this? And what about, like, asking like 18,000 questions based off what Paul's reporting? Paul isn't trying to give a historical defense of the Christian faith. He's explaining the gospel. And if you actually read 1 Corinthians 15, he says it in verse 1. Now, I want to make it clear for you, brothers and sisters, the gospel I preached to you, which you received, on which you have taken your stand, and by which you are being saved, if you hold to the message I preached to you, unless you believed in vain. For I passed on to you. So, by the way, this is Paul being passed on this information, most likely by the disciples, what the gospel is. He's not trying to make a historical argument. Now, these facts are rooted in a historical fact, but that's not the purpose for what Paul is writing. So all of these questions that Alex is trying to throw on the Apostle Paul, he's just not interested. He wants the Church of Corinth to understand what is the gospel. That's the purpose of why Paul is writing this.
Anything about this extraordinary event. And also, even if Jesus did appear to 500 people, how many of them actually believed what they saw? Again, we're not told. Maybe there was an appearance, but only some of them believed it. Remember, Matthew's gospel tells us that even when Jesus appeared right in front of his 11 disciples, some of them doubted. They'd lived with Jesus, and he was standing right in front of them, but they didn't believe. Many people ask me, why would the disciples have believed in the risen Christ if they didn't actually see him? In response, I point to this verse in Matthew and ask the reverse. How could the disciples have seen him and then not believed? With the 500...
Because that's crazy. Because people don't rise from the dead. That's why. Because they saw Jesus disfigured, hung on a cross, beaten, bruised, bloodied, stabbed. And Isaiah talks about Jesus could not even be recognized. That's why they struggle to believe it, because people don't rise from the dead. Wouldn't you do the same thing? If you actually saw, let's say, a passed away family member that you saw being buried in the grave, you knew was confirmed dead, and they showed up 3 days later at your doorstep, wouldn't you in that moment be like, I don't really believe that's you. I'm probably seeing something. And that's why Jesus said, well, hey, touch my hands. Like, see the holes. That's why Jesus said that. It's because of the extraordinary event. That's why they struggled to believe it, even though they were seeing it before their very eyes.
We're not told how many of them believed that they saw Jesus. If some of the disciples doubted that it was him, why would we trust an unnamed mass of strangers mentioned briefly in one source by a man who wasn't there but heard that they'd seen him? And even if all...
We don't have to, because the other apostles already advocated for the risen Christ, which is why they went from, as Wes mentioned, I think he mentioned previously, they went from these scared disciples to bold proclaimers of the gospel of Jesus Christ.
All of the 500 people did believe that it was Jesus. How would Paul know this? Even if he was there, which he wasn't, did he interview them? Was there a show of hands for anyone who doubted before the crowd dispersed? There was no easy way even for Paul to know what these people believed, which makes it impossible for us to know what they believed. And even
Paul isn't interested in whether or not all 500 believed. He's interested in the historical fact of the event, but the purpose of him writing this is the gospel. It's so that people can be saved, not trying to give them a history lesson.
if the 500 people did all believe it was Jesus, how many of them were already predisposed to think this? Remember, sometimes groups do claim to see visions. So
as you keep listening, this is a hyper-skeptic view of everything being told, regardless of the evidence. And this is why I'm so disappointed in this video with Alex, is he's questioning and nitpicking every single little point as if they're really valid.
there's various apparitions of Mary or the Roman Emperor Constantine in Fatima, Portugal in 1917. This form prophesied miracle, and we actually know who saw it. But Alex, how do you explain this then? If it didn't actually happen, why would there even be this rumor of 500 people seeing Jesus? Well, I'm glad you asked. I want to share an idea that I learned from the Christian biblical scholar Dale Allison in his glorious book on the resurrection of Jesus. Think about this for a moment. How could, quote, more than 500 people all see the man Jesus, quote, at one time? That's a pretty large group of people. How closely could they have examined him? How could they all have got a good view at one time? Imagine a celebrity like...
Think about this for a second. Do you know any other stories in the gospel where maybe there were hundreds of people? Or what about thousands of people that were there trying to watch Jesus? I don't know. Have you maybe heard the story of Jesus feeding the 5,000, which most people believe it wasn't actually 5,000 people, it was 5,000 men, which if you include women and children were most likely more than 5,000. So I feel like if Jesus could be in front of over 5,000 people preaching and teaching, I don't think it's pretty crazy for 500 people to see Jesus.
People in the street. How well Greek in which Paul was writing? Here's Paul talking about certain that it was him. Here's where it gets real.
And this is the last point that I want to hit on, which I think is completely dismantled. And Alex just blatantly tells a lie just to try and prove his own point.
Interesting. Let's take a look at what Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, but in the original Greek in which Paul was writing. Here's Paul talking about the appearances. He appeared to Cephas, that's Peter, and then to the 12, then he appeared to the 500. But notice that in between the words appeared and 500, we have this word, excuse my pronunciation, epano. This word is typically translated here as more than. Hence, Jesus appeared to more than 500 brothers. But let's investigate this word epano. Every other time it appears in the New Testament, it's translated differently. The word epano means not more.
Real quick. Every other time this word is translated differently. Remember that claim.
Than, but over or above or upon. The only place in the whole New Testament where this word is translated to mean more than is, you guessed it, 1 Corinthians chapter 15. That's why, by the way, interestingly, if you look at the King James version of this verse, you'll read the following. After that, he was seen of above 500 brethren at once. Above. It's interesting, right? So looking at the Greek, it seems plausible that Jesus did not appear to more than 500 people, but rather he appeared above 500 people.
Which is kind of weird because what's even making the point? Because even if it was 500 people, only 500 people, that's still a crazy claim. But let's just actually see if what Alex said to be true. Oh, snap. I just wound up on this verse, Mark chapter 14. This story of Jesus while he was in Bethany at the house of Simon the leper. As he was reclining at the table, a woman came with an alabaster jar, a very expensive perfume of pure nard. She broke the jar and poured it on his head. But some were expressing the indignation to one another. Why has this perfume been wasted? For this perfume might have been sold for more than 300 denarii and given to the poor. And they began to scold her. More than. Well, Alex said that word, that Greek word, only appears in 1 Corinthians 15:6. And if he said it, that means it must be true. Oh, snap. Is that the same Greek word that's in 1 Corinthians? Hey, you know what? I might be wrong. Let me see here. Let me go to the concordance and say, oh my goodness. It's the same word used in 1 Corinthians 15:6. He just told a blatant lie. So I just wanted to make this video and just kind of address some of the things that Alex tried to nitpick about Wes Huff. Wes, praise God, you did an amazing job on Joe Rogan representing Christians all over the world. You should be proud. And Alex, I love you, man. You do such a good job at still manning the Christian position, but this video was not it. You went back to like your old, like 6 year ago, late teenage phase of just spewing just overly skeptic nonsense, and it was just really, really disappointing. I hope this video encouraged you. We have good grounds to believe what we believe. Check out my last video. I talked about Wes Huff on Joe Rogan, how he shared the gospel with him. My name is David Narvaez, but it's not about me. It's not about you. It's not about David. It's all about Jesus and how we can know, love, and follow him. See y'all in the next one.